As we continue to cover this story, we do want to bring into the conversation our friend there, former federal prosecutor and legal analyst, Neama Rahmani. We're going to bring him in just a moment, though. I do want to put this up. This just kind of highlights what we're talking about. This is about the birthright citizenship executive order. Josh Gerstein there at Politico saying, for those keeping track at home, Trump's birthright citizenship executive order has now gone 0 for 3 at preliminary injunction hearings. A Fed judge in New Hampshire blocked it this morning, following his colleagues in Maryland and Washington state as well. We're also getting news in from just over the weekend. A federal judge on Saturday blocked Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency from accessing Treasury Department records that contain sensitive personal data of millions of Americans, like Social Security numbers and bank account numbers. Also, just today, a federal district court judge in Boston temporarily blocked the Trump administration from reducing health research grants. The judge in that case issued a temporary restraining order barring the administration from imposing the cuts in 22 states that earlier in the day had sued here. All right, let's talk about all this. I want to bring into the conversation Neama Rahmani. He joins me. Neama, good to see you here. I was looking on social media. Some legal analysts like yourself, they're describing this as a TRO palooza, temporary restraining order. Are federal judges overstepping in these cases, in your view?
Not necessarily, Andrew, because a temporary restraining order doesn't necessarily mean that Trump and the government lose. It just maintains the status quo. So these funds, for instance, aren't permanently withheld. And the judge basically, in each of these cases, wants to say, hey, I need full briefing. And this is an issue of constitutional importance. It should really go up potentially to the circuit court or even the Supreme Court. If you're talking about issues like birthright citizenship, of course, that touches upon the 14th Amendment, impoundment. That's a separation of powers issue because, of course, Congress has the power of the purse. So that doesn't necessarily mean that Trump is going to lose, but the judge is going to say, hey, we're making some sweeping changes here, and let's make sure we're doing it right.
You know, there does seem to be a clash that is set up as we speak between Article 1 and Article 2, Congress and the executive here, about what the executive wants to do with kind of abrogating some of these already appropriated funds. And I'm talking about this federal funding freeze. The memo by OMB was rescinded, though apparently the spirit of the memo was still alive and well, so much so that the federal judge there intervened. The judge today did not find the White House, though, in contempt of court. Remember, that's what some of the allegations were, that the White House was not going to follow these judges' rulings with respect to the restraining orders here. The White House issued waivers that theoretically should have allowed funding to go out. And in others, the White House argued funds were stopped under a different memo than the one involved in this suit here. So I wanted to ask, because we have a statement in from the White House, and they say this, quote, each executive order will hold up in court because every action of the Trump-Vance administration is completely lawful. Any legal challenge against it is nothing more than an attempt to undermine the will of the American people. So I asked you if the judiciary was overstepping. Is the executive branch? These are congressionally appropriated funds, and many of these grants we're talking about that are ready to be spent and are languishing but have been put on pause for now. What do you make of that?
Potentially, yes, in terms of overstepping. And this is why. We talked about separation of powers and how funds that are lawfully appropriated by Congress, they're supposed to be spent. And if they aren't spent, that's called an impoundment. And under the Presidential Impoundment Act, the executive is supposed to go back to the legislature, go back to Congress and say, hey, I don't want to spend these funds. And Congress can choose to not spend them or to spend them. Usually when there's no discretion, there's nothing that the executive branch and the agencies can do. Frankly, this is something that conservatives have hailed, the growth of the administrative state. They don't want the executive branch to be making these decisions when they've been made by Congress. Now, of course, Congress can go back and say, you know, we're not going to issue funds and we're not going to appropriate this, and that'll be a different story. But once the funds have been appropriated, the executive is supposed to spend it.
Yeah, other highlights from the filing today. The judge says the defendants, i.e. the White House, acknowledged they were supposed to pause implementation of the freeze. The White House is directed to immediately restore frozen funds during the pendency of the TRO until the court hears and decides the preliminary injunction request here. This is all coming after Vice President Vance made some comments over the weekend about some of these actions from federal judges. He said this, quote, "Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power." That's obviously a statement critics said could precipitate a constitutional crisis, although Vance's use of the word legitimate may couch it a bit. Do you agree with Vance's assertion here? Should he have said that?
I do not. And Andrew, I know you're a Wolverine. My parents went to Ohio State. I went to Harvard and Vance went to Yale. That's a dangerous statement. And we haven't had an executive say that they weren't going to follow a lawful court ruling, potentially since Nixon. But going back to Abraham Lincoln, the executive branch is supposed to lawfully carry out the law as determined by the courts. And we saw this for the civil rights movement, for instance. A lot of folks thought that was unpopular and was wrong, but it was the executive branch that carried out those orders. So, I understand that maybe Vance and other folks aren't happy with these district judges, but rest assured, these cases will work their way up to the Supreme Court, and there, the conservative majority will determine one way or another whether this is lawful or not. But for legislatures or members of the executive branch, whether they're cabinet level appointees, the vice president, or even the president, to say that they're not going to follow the law, that is potentially very dangerous.
Yeah, to your point, is this just the system working its way out like it is intended and designed to do? Or is, to your point, a failure of imagination at play here? Do we know what would happen if a White House does not comply with a federal judge's order? Have we been in that territory before? Because you and I, during the Biden administration, we have been here before. We have been here with executive orders put out by the Biden administration. A federal judge of whichever district tamps it down and puts it on pause and issues a stay, what have you. This isn't new territory in that respect.
No, and this is all procedural and it's temporary. Let's not forget, judges are just putting these orders on hold temporarily. Then there's briefing. Then there's a hearing on a permanent restraining order. And immediately, any injunction, it can be immediately appealed. That is the law. It will go up to the circuit court. And of course, if there's a circuit split, the Supreme Court will weigh in and they're going to make decisions on all these issues. And regardless of how you think about them, the Supreme Court has acted very quickly with respect to Donald Trump, fast tracking. So I fully expect, whether it's birthright citizenship, whether it's DOJ, whether it's funding, all these issues are going to make their way, and those 9 justices are going to decide this one way and forever, permanently.
Yeah, the judge in this particular case says the states who brought suit, presented evidence the White House continued to block funding despite being ordered to pause implementation of that very funding freeze. Last point on this, let's move to another issue here, and that is this entity within the federal government that was just created by executive order. That's DOJ, led by Elon Musk, and kind of a ragtag band of young people who are looking for ways to cut waste, fraud, and abuse here. Although that judge on Saturday blocked DOJ from accessing Treasury Department records, a separate federal judge allowed them to access records within the Labor Department here. This is a federal entity wanting information in another federal entity. Do I have that right? Help me make that make sense.
That's absolutely right. Obviously, this is a new entity. And again, this is something that typically conservatives don't like. Of course, DOJ is there to slash these other agencies, maybe departments outright. Some have been named, like the Department of Education, and the Consumer Financial Protection Board. Those have been major targets. But generally speaking, you need a congressional act to create an agency or department. You need appropriation. Obviously, we're talking about federal privacy laws, a very specific issue that was addressed by the judges. Obviously, when we're talking about firings, there's civil service protections. A lot of folks believe, like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and the unitary executive, that the president can fire whomever he wants in the executive branch. Of course, they can appeal. There's a board that they can, federal employees do have some civil service protections that are set forth by law. But ultimately, I think the executive will likely get what they want with respect to personnel decisions ultimately, because I think that's historically how it's been.
All right, Neama Rahmani, we're going to have to leave it at that. We do appreciate your insight. I think we'll be talking a lot more in the coming weeks. Neama, thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Talk soon.